Education is, in its general sense, a form of learning in which the knowledge, skills, values, beliefs, and habits of a group of people are transferred from one generation to the next through storytelling, discussion, teaching, training, and/or research. Education may also include formal transmission of such information from one human being to another. So far so good, right? Education is in general sense. It's a form of learning. Education is a form of learning, right? In which these things are transferred from one generation to the next. What are those things? Knowledge, skills, values, beliefs, and habits of a group of people. How? How are these things transferred? Through storytelling, discussion, teaching, training, and research. Education may also include informal transmission of such information from one human being to another. Now, we have formal education and informal, right? And transmission is like when things are transferred. Education frequently takes place under the guidance of others, but learners may also educate themselves. Yeah? Sometimes some people like to learn by themselves, me included. Any experience that has a formative effect on the way one thinks, feels, or acts may be considered educational. So, how can an experience be considered educational? Any experience that has a formative effect. What is a formative effect? It forms. It forms something. Forms the way we think, feel, or act. Anything that forms the way people. So anything that has a formative effect on, remember, has an effect on the way one feels, thinks, feels, or acts may be considered educational. And remember, to be considered something, it is considered great. It is considered educational. It has a great effect on. It has a formative effect on. It has a bad effect on, a negative effect on. Have an effect on. Right? Education is commonly and formally divided into stages such as preschool, primary school, secondary school, and then college, university, or apprenticeship. So, education is commonly and formally divided. See? Adverbs before. So, it is commonly divided. Generally. Instead of commonly, I can say generally and formally. So, I can say generally divided. Yeah? Instead of saying commonly, I can say generally. So education is commonly divided or generally divided. Generally. Double L only. Divided into stages such as preschool, primary school, secondary school, and then college, university, or apprenticeship. This term is read what? Apprenticeship. Remember? Apprentice? Say apprenticeship.
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 Yeah, it's apprenticeship, but we usually say apprenticeship. In American English,
Apprenticeship.
we usually say apprenticeship. So he's an apprentice. Apprentice or apprentice?
Apprentice.
The science and art of how best to teach is called pedagogy. You know, we have pedagogy or pedagogy. Both are correct. You can say pedagogy or pedagogy. Or pedagogy, some would say, but pedagogy. So the science and art of teaching is called pedagogy. And pedagogue, remember, pedagogue was a person who teaches, especially children. So you remember the word pedagogue, which was the person who teaches, especially children. Now, the question is, do people have the right to education? Does everybody have the right to education? Let's see. Every child who's born has a right to education. A right to education has been recognized by some governments. So to recognize a right, to recognize something, right? It means they have recognized, they have admitted, they have recognized, acknowledged that this right exists, that people have the right. Recognized. A right to education has been recognized by some governments. At the global level, means at the international level, right? Article 13 of the United Nations 1966 International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So an article of the UN resolution, covenant, recognizes the right of everyone to recognize the rights of everyone to an education. Is there a government in the world that does not recognize the right of its citizens to education? I think almost every government in the world recognizes the right of its people to education. Although education is compulsory in most places up to a certain age. Yeah, remember compulsory?
Yeah.
It's a must. It's obligatory, mandatory. So although education is compulsory in most places up to a certain age, this age, what's from country to country? The age of compulsory education, up to a certain age. This age varies from country to country, differs from country to country. Yeah? Attendance at school often isn't. So education is compulsory, but attendance is not compulsory. And a minority of parents choose homeschooling, sometimes with the assistance of modern electronic educational technology, also called e-learning. So it's saying essentially that education up to a certain age is compulsory, but school attendance is not necessarily compulsory. That's why some parents choose to homeschool their children. So homeschooling is an option. E-learning especially. E-learning is for electronic, right? Email is electronic mail. Education can take place in formal or informal settings. It could be formal. Now, who started the first school in the world? That's good to know. Who started the first school? It was Plato. Yeah? You definitely have a word for Plato in Japanese and in Spanish. I'm sure you don't say Plato to Plato. You have a different word. I want you to find that word because Plato is very important. In the Greek civilization, and Roman civilization also, now Plato is known as the person who started logic. He started school and schooling. And his teacher was Socrates, and his student was Aristotle. So these three words, Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates, are good to know. Plato founded. What does founded mean? Established. Yeah? He's the founder. So Plato is the founder. Founder. So let me get a little larger here. So founder. So Plato is the founder. To found means to establish, right? To establish. So Plato is the founder of the first school, right? So Plato founded or established the academy, where? In Athens. Athens is a city in Greece. The first institution of higher learning in Europe. So that was the first institution of higher learning in Europe. The city of Alexandria in Egypt, founded in 330, that is 4th century BC before Christ, became the successor to Athens as the intellectual cradle of ancient Greece.
This question.
So Alexandria in Egypt, that was founded when? 330 years before Christ. Now we are in the year 2015. So that is 300 years before Christ. So it's 4 centuries then. It's the 21st century. It's 25 centuries ago. It was a successor to Athens. You know successor? It's a good word. So I want you to look at this. We have predecessor and the opposite of successor. Now, do you know Obama's predecessor? Who was President Obama's predecessor? Who was he? Obama's predecessor. George Bush. George Bush was Obama's predecessor. Yeah? What is the verb? We have to precede. The other one is to succeed. So Obama succeeded Bush. Means came after Bush. Obama succeeded Bush. Bush preceded Obama. I'm sorry, there's an E after D here. So to precede, and to precede is different from to proceed, right? To proceed means what? To go ahead, to continue. Yeah? To proceed means to continue. To proceed means to continue. Please proceed means please continue. Precede means to come before. If something is preceded by, you know, preceded by is different from followed by. Followed by. Please learn these things. If something is preceded by, it's different from followed by. Preceded by is different from followed by. So, the speech is followed by lunch. Means what? Lunch will be after the speech, right? Followed by. If it's preceded by, it means it's before.
Preceded and proceeded.
Mm-hmm. That's unprocessed we have.
Yeah, but first.
So just for us, let's remember, if something predecessor, successor. Now, what country succeeded Great Britain as the world's most powerful nation? At the turn of the 20th century, another country succeeded the United Kingdom as the world's most powerful nation. The United States succeeded Great Britain as the world's most powerful nation at the turn of the 20th century. It was after Great Britain. Yes? Now, if some city is a successor to that city, like we have, let's go back. So remember, predecessor, successor. Predecessor, successor. Yeah? In your university, the president before this president is the predecessor. The current president of the university is the successor to that president. To precede, to succeed. Obama's predecessor is George W. Bush. Who preceded Bush? Who was Bush's predecessor? Do you remember? Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was succeeded by George Bush. Okay. So the city of Alexandria in Egypt, founded in 330 BC, that is before Christ, became the successor to Athens as the intellectual cradle of ancient Greece. The intellectual cradle. What is cradle? A baby, you put a baby in the cradle, right? Yes? In the cradle, you put the baby, the mothers put the babies in cradle, and they move the cradle a little bit, tilt it left and right, so the baby sleeps. So Athens is the intellectual beginning of ancient Greece, right? The city of Alexandria was a cradle. We have, for example, the cradle of civilization. Cradle of civilization. Have you heard it? Study from the cradle to the grave. The grave. Study from the cradle to the grave. Study from the cradle to the grave. And let me show you cradle as the images. Cradle. So these are cradles for kids, right? Yeah? So if somebody says study from the cradle to the grave, it's an expression. In English we say study from the cradle to the grave. If you study from the cradle to the grave, what does that mean? You study from the time you're born until you die. I'm sure in your languages we have something for it. It's an expression, study from the cradle to the grave. Now, the cradle of civilization, the first cradle of civilization was Mesopotamia, today's Iraq. It's south of Iraq today. That was the cradle of civilization. Then we had China, then we had the Persian, civilization. Those civilizations were the old civilizations in the world. Their mathematician, mathematician, remember? Their mathematician Euclid and anatomist, a person who knows the anatomy, right? Anatomist Herophilus constructed the great library of Alexandria and translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek. They translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek. Greek is a Greek language, right? European civilization suffered a collapse of literacy and organization following the fall of Rome in 476 after date, that is, after Christ, in the 5th century. What happened? European civilizations suffered a collapse of literacy. Collapse of literacy. Remember literacy? The ability to read and write. So collapse of literacy, that is people, again, they became illiterate, right? Illiterate. In China, Confucius, that was the 6th century BC, right? Of the state of Lu, was the country's most influential ancient philosopher. Influential, huh? He was the country's most influential ancient philosopher, who had a lot of influence, a lot of effects, whose educational outlook continues to influence the societies of China and neighbors like Korea, Japan, and Vietnam today. Yes? So the most influential ancient philosopher in China was Confucius, right? 6 centuries before Christ. After the fall of Rome, the Catholic Church became the sole preserver of literate scholarship in Western Europe. So after the fall of Rome, it was a Catholic Church that became the sole. The sole means the only. The sole means the only. The only. Like when I say after the collapse of communism, or after the collapse of Soviet Union, Soviet Union? The country that today we call Russia. Yeah? It was a huge country. In 1991, what happened? The United States became the world's sole superpower. Sole superpower, the only superpower in the world. That was, I think even if I make it low, 36, it's... So after the collapse of Soviet Union in 1991, because Soviet Union was a huge country, and it collapsed, and it was divided into so many smaller countries. Not so many, it was smaller countries. The United States became the world's sole superpower. The only superpower. So this soul is different from the soul, S-O-U-L, right? S-O-U-L is different. The soul is inside human body. That's the soul spirit, huh? Soul and spirit. But soul, S-O-L-E, the soul superpower. So after the fall of Rome, the Catholic Church became the sole preserver, keeper of literate scholarship studies in Western Europe. Now the Church established cathedral schools in early Middle Ages as centers of advanced education. So the Church established cathedral schools. So after the fall of Rome, when? In 476 AD. So the Rome was the main city in the West. It was very important for the West because Rome was the most ancient civilization after Greek civilization. Rome was the successor to the Greek civilization, and Rome became the new cradle of Western civilization. So Rome, the city of Rome fell. It was defeated and burnt in fire in 476, and you know the story of Julius Caesar and what happened. There are movies about it. So when Rome fell, it was the church that became the keeper, the preserver of education in Europe. It was the Catholic Church. And the church established cathedral schools in the early Middle Ages. You know the Middle Ages, right? Yeah? People say Middle Ages actually start with the fall of Rome. So when Rome fell, that was the beginning of Middle Ages. Until the 15th century, that is from the 5th century until 14th, 15th century, we have the Middle Ages. Now we have early Middle Ages, Middle Middle Ages, and late Middle Ages. Mid-Middle Ages and late Middle Ages. Middle Ages comes all the way to the 15th and 16th century at the beginning of modern times. The modern times started, people say, with the start of the Gutenberg's invention of the typing press, actually the printing machine. Some of these ultimately means eventually, huh? Eventually. Finally. Yes? You know, ultimately, finally, eventually evolved, expanded into medieval universities. They became universities, these cathedral schools. So the word eventually is a good word. So if I say ultimately, eventually, finally, At last. Yeah? Ultimately, finally, eventually, at the end, well, in the end, evolved into medieval universities and forebears of many of Europe's modern universities. The forefathers. Yeah? Forebears or forefathers, the ancestors, forefathers, ancestors. So eventually he died, right? Ultimately. So, you know, ancestor? Yeah. Of many of Europe's modern universities. The University of Bologna is considered the oldest continually operating university. It's the oldest university that has operated continually. You have the text. What are you looking at, Maka? Elsewhere during the Middle Ages, Islamic science and mathematics flourished. Flourish is a good word. Like flower, when something flourishes, it grows up and becomes flourished, developed. So I have, if I go to the word flourish here, flourished as a verb, to flourish. The economy is booming and businesses are flourishing. Are flourishing. Means to develop, become successful. To grow well and be very healthy. Most plants will flourish in the rich, deep soils here. To flourish. To be successful and mathematics flourished under the Islamic Caliphate established across the Middle East, extending from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to the Indus in the east and to the Almoravid dynasty in Mali Empire in the south. So there was this happened around after the 7th century. About 7th, 8th, 9th century that the Muslims, they conquered parts of Europe. The end of 7th century and 8th century. They went all the way to the Iberian Peninsula. Iberian Peninsula is Portugal and Spain. They went there. And on the other hand, they went all the way to the Indus Valley of India. And down there, the Persian Empire and everywhere. So they were all over the place. But mathematics, they were good at mathematics. And so the Renaissance, or Renaissance, like how would you say Renaissance in Spanish? The Renaissance?
Nacimiento.
Okay, whatever.
Nacimiento.
So the Renaissance was a big revolution in Europe, right? It happened. So the Renaissance or the Renaissance in Europe to usher in a new age means to start a new age. It usually comes together to usher in a new age. And I want you to learn it. The Renaissance in Europe ushered in a new age of scientific and intellectual inquiry, or inquiry. Scientific and intellectual inquiry. It was an age of new scientific research. An appreciation of ancient Greek and Roman civilization. Around 1450, that is the 15th century, this is one of the most major things that happened in the history of education and in the history of mankind. Johannes Gutenberg developed a printing press. Now, for the first time, books were printed, not just written by manuscript. Before that, people wrote things by hand, right? So 1450 was the time that Gutenberg developed a printing press, which allowed works of literature to spread more quickly. The European Age of Empires saw European ideas of education and philosophy, religion, art, and sciences spread out across the globe, across the world. Missionaries and scholars also brought back new ideas from other civilizations. Who were the missionaries? The priests and the people who went outside. These were the priests who actually went to other countries to preach. These were the preachers. Preachers who went to other countries to preach the religions, Christianity, to convert others to Christianity. And scholars. Scholars are those academic people who go to school, and they also brought back new ideas from other civilizations. And you know civilization, right? The Enlightenment. Enlightenment. What is Enlightenment? Enlightenment started in France in 17th century. People started asking questions. Why? Why is this like this? Why is this like that? We don't want to just follow some text. They started making questions about everything. And many philosophers came. This was the beginning of the scientific method, because the scientific method said we should experiment everything. We should test everything. So they said, why? We should test many beliefs, including religious beliefs and philosophies. Many people started raising questions and doubts about religious beliefs. They said, no, we should ask questions. Before the Age of Enlightenment in France, nobody would ask questions about God, about heaven and earth, about Christianity, about the church. But the Age of Enlightenment saw the emergence of a more secular educational outlook in Europe. Secular means not religious, right? Because people, during the Age of Enlightenment, started asking questions about religion, about the things that everybody took for granted before. They thought, okay, that's it. Now, preschools. Preschools provide education from ages 4 to 8, right? Usually it's 4 and 5. When children enter primary education, also known as nursery schools and as kindergartens, except in the USA, where kindergarten is a term used for primary education. So in USA and also in Canada now, it's a new thing in Canada, in Ontario. Kindergarten is also part of formal schooling. It's part of primary education. Preschool education is important because it can give a child a competitive edge. A competitive edge is very good in education. It makes children competitive, right? Yeah? If something gives you a competitive edge, it makes you able to compete with others. It gives you something that's better than other kids. That means a child that goes to kindergarten has a competitive edge or advantage over other children, right? In education and employment. While children who do not receive the fundamentals during their preschool years will be taught the alphabet, counting, shapes, and colors when they begin their formal education, they will be behind the children who already possess that knowledge. So, see, the structure that I always tell you should use, while something, comma, you see? While children who do not receive the la 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 la, comma, something else after that. So, while Japan is bigger, much smaller than the United States, it is much more populous, has a larger population. So while children who do not receive the fundamentals during their preschool years will be taught the alphabet, counting, shapes, and colors when they begin their formal education, they will be behind the children who already possess that knowledge. Who already possess means have, right? Possess that knowledge. Children. So kids, basically what it means is, those children who do not go to kindergarten, they will be behind the kids that go to kindergarten. Because those who go to kindergarten, they study shapes, alphabet, everything before they go to elementary school. And when they go to elementary school together, those who did not study this at kindergarten will be behind the other kids. Kindergarten provides a child-centered preschool curriculum for 3 to 7-year-olds. There should be an S. Please add an S here. So kindergarten provides a child-centered preschool curriculum for 3 to 7-year-olds. It means for 3 to 7-year-old kids. Now how about primary school? Primary or elementary education consists of the first 5 to 7 years of formal structured education. 5 to 7 years, right? In the US and Canada, it's 6 years after preschool or kindergarten. Now, including kindergarten, it would be 6 to 7 years. In general, primary education consists of 6 to 8 years of schooling, starting at the age of 5 or 6. Although this varies between and sometimes within countries. Sometimes inside a country it changes. Now in Ontario here in Canada, children can have the option to start their primary education at the age of 4, going to the kindergarten. They can go to junior kindergarten, and after that it's senior kindergarten at the age of 5, and at the age of 6 they start elementary school. But elementary school plus preschool is called primary education. Globally, around 89%, that is about 90% of children aged 6 to 12 are enrolled in primary education. So that's a good thing. So globally, about 90% of kids are in school. They're enrolled in primary education. And this proportion is rising. And this proportion is rising. What is proportion? The relative numbers, 90% to whatever, is rising. Under the Education for All programs driven by UNESCO, UNESCO is the arm for children for the United Nations, right? Most countries have committed to achieving universal enrollment in primary education by 2015. So most countries have committed to they said that we are committed to achieving, universal means world international, but universal coverage, healthcare coverage. If you see universal here, it doesn't mean international or worldly or something. If it's universal insurance coverage, it means everybody will be insured. Universal voting rights in a country, everybody will have the right to vote. Universal education, enrollment in school means every child will be enrolled or registered in primary education by 2015. That means by this year, from 90% to 100% of children should be enrolled. And in many countries it is compulsory, including in Canada, the United States. The division between primary and secondary education is somewhat arbitrary. We've had the word arbitrary in essential words. Arbitrary, it means the division between primary and secondary education is somewhat arbitrary. It's a kind of random division. It is not based on any special reason or logic. Yeah? It depends on the rules. Rule-based. Now one country says, okay, in our country, the age 14 is the age. Another country says that's arbitrary. It's just, they decide. But it generally occurs at about 11 or 12 years of age. 12 years of age. 11 years of age. Some education systems have separate middle schools, with the transition to the final stage of secondary education taking place at around the age of 14. So with the transition to the final stage of secondary education taking place at around the age of 14. At around the age of 14, people go to senior high school, right? So middle school is finished and they go to high school. Schools that provide primary education are mostly referred to as primary schools or elementary schools, of course. Yeah? Primary schools are often subdivided into infant schools and junior school. So junior school and infant schools are schools like nurseries and kindergarten stuff. Let's go to secondary. In most contemporary educational systems of the world, what is contemporary? Modern. Now, not old, not traditional, right? So contemporary, huh? Mako, say contemporary.
Contemporary.
Yeah, you go.
Contemporary.
Contemporary.
Perfect. Contemporary. In most contemporary educational systems of the world, secondary education comprises, means consists of, so in most contemporary educational systems of the world, in most current educational systems of the world, secondary education comprises or consists of the formal education that happens during adolescence. You know adolescence? Adolescence is the age, like teenage. Teenage is adolescence. 13 to 19 or 12 to 20. 12. Yeah. So adolescence is teenage. Adolescence. During adolescence, it is characterized. What are the characteristics of it? What's the character of it? It is characterized. It is characterized by. What are the true signs of it? The marks. It is characterized by transition from the typically compulsory comprehensive primary education for minors, small children, minors, to the optional selective tertiary or post-secondary or higher education, university or vocational school for adults. So secondary school, or senior high school or high school, that's the transition place where you go from the compulsory education to optional education. Compulsory education for kids is over. Now adults, they can choose to go to school, higher education, university, college, vocational school to learn trades, skills. Minors means small children. Minors are people below the legal age when you are underage. You know underage? When you're underage, you're a minor. So, legally underage. To the optional selective tertiary. Remember tertiary education? Primary, secondary, tertiary, or post-secondary, or higher education. Depending on the system, schools for this period, or a part of it, may be called secondary or high schools, middle schools, colleges, or vocational schools. The exact meaning of any of these terms varies from one system to another. I love the structure. Varies from, changes from. Yeah? So varies from means changes from one system to another. I want you to be able to use the word vary.
Varies.
The exact boundary between primary and secondary education. What is boundary between two countries, right? The border. So we have boundary or border. You know border, right? There's a border between. Is there a border between Japan and any other country?
No.
No, because Japan is an island. How about Spain has a boundary?
Yeah, France and Portugal.
Well, we say, is there a boundary between science and art?
Between.
Sometimes there's a boundary between student and teacher, right? So the exact boundary between primary and secondary education also varies from country to country. Yes, it changes from country to country. In some countries, it's at the age of 13. In some countries, it's from 12 to. And even within them, even inside a country, yeah, within means even inside Canada, in Ontario, it is different from the British Columbia. But it's generally around the 7th to the 10th year of schooling. Yeah? Secondary education occurs mainly during the teenage years. What was the name for it?
Or what?
Adolescence, right?
Adolescence.
We had the word just a second ago. In the United States, Canada, and Australia, primary and secondary education together are sometimes referred to as K-12 education. So in Canada, United States, and Australia, we call it K-12 education. It means kindergarten to grade 12. And in New Zealand, year 1 to 13 is used. The purpose of secondary education can be to give common knowledge. What is the purpose of secondary education?
Common knowledge.
To give common knowledge to prepare for higher education, or to train directly in a profession. So the purpose of secondary education is to give common knowledge, also to prepare for higher education, or to train directly in a profession. The emergence of secondary education in the United States did not happen until 1910. So it just happened about a century ago. Secondary education. There was no secondary education in the US until a century ago. Caused by the rise in big businesses and technological advances in factories. Big businesses and technological, right? Technological advances in factories. For instance, I want you to be able to use for instance instead of for example sometimes, right? So instead of saying for example, sometimes you say for instance. Say technological advances, Yuko.
Technological. Yeah.
Technological advances.
Technological advances.
Very good. Technological advances. Javi,
Technological advances.
thank you. Mako,
Technological advances.
advances, no. Technological advances. We talked about Shua, advances.
Technological advances.
Technological advances.
Technological advances.
Very good. The emergence of electrification. It's caused by the rise in the big businesses and technological advances in factories that required skilled workers. So factories needed skilled workers, and skilled workers were not around. So there should be schools, right? There should have been schools. In order to meet this new job demand, to meet a demand, guys, to meet a need. To meet a need or to meet a demand, to meet this demand, to meet this need, high schools were created. So high schools were created to meet this demand. To meet this need, to satisfy this need. So what do you do with a need? You meet a need, you satisfy a need. So high schools were created to meet this need with a curriculum focused on practical job skills. So what was the curriculum? You know, remember curriculum? It's the syllabus, the things that you study at school. What was the focus of the? It was practical job skills. Because so secondary education of the time was like the colleges of today, a century ago. Focused on practical job skills that would better prepare students for white collar or skilled blue collar work. So white collar and blue collar it's, you know, collar? This is the collar of my shirt. Now, white collar jobs are jobs that are professional. They're highly experts. Now, blue collar jobs are mostly manual jobs, the jobs done by hand. So if you hear white collar jobs and blue collar jobs, white collar jobs are done by experts. A financial analyst does a white collar job, sits at a desk and calculates things. But a worker in a factory, that's a blue collar job. Manual labor. So if I say manual, like a manual transmission car, manual labor means something done by hand, right? We need a few more minutes before our lunch break. This proved to be beneficial for both employers and employees. This was beneficial for both of them, had benefits, right? Beneficial for both employers, and employees. Employers and employees. Employees, right? For the improvement in human capital caused employees to become more efficient. Human capital means like looking as human beings as capital, right? We are assets. The improvement in human capital caused employees to become more efficient. And this efficiency lowered the costs for the employer, and skilled employees received a higher wage than employees with just primary educational attainments. Attained, remember? Attain, gain, attainment, obtain, attain, to get. Those who had only attained primary education, they were not getting as much as paid as those who went to school. In Europe, grammar schools or academies date from as early as 16th century. Grammar schools go all the way back to 16th century. Community colleges offer non-residential junior college courses to people living in a particular area. Now, there are also community colleges. A quick look at tertiary education, and I just read this as quickly as I can. Higher education, also called tertiary, third stage, or post-secondary education, is the non-compulsory, it's not compulsory, right? It's optional, educational level that follows the completion of a school providing a secondary education, such as high school or secondary school. So after secondary school, you go to tertiary school. Tertiary education is normally taken to include undergraduate and postgraduate education, as well as vocational education and training. So we've talked about it, right? When you go to university or college, undergraduate is Bachelor of Arts, yes? Master of Arts or Bachelor of Science, MA, BA, and BS. Whereas postgraduate was Master's and PhD, right? Bachelor's degree is undergraduate, master's degree or PhD, that's postgraduate. And vocational education is when you go to a college to learn the welding, for example, the carpentry and things like that. Colleges and universities are the main institutions that provide tertiary education. You want tertiary education? You can either go to college or university. Collectively means together, collectively, it's a good word. Collectively means together. These are sometimes known as tertiary institutions. So tertiary education generally results in, to result in what? Result in. I want you to learn this. This is very good for writing. To result in. Tertiary education generally results in the receipt of certificates, diplomas, or academic degrees. Certificate and diplomas for college, degrees from universities, right? Bachelor's degree, master's degree, PhD, postdoctoral, doctoral degrees. We talked about it. University education includes teaching, research, and social service activities, and it includes both the undergraduate level, sometimes referred to as tertiary education, and graduate or postgraduate level, sometimes referred to as graduate school. If you go to graduate school, you're getting your master's or PhD. If you're a grad student, graduate student, master's or PhD. Undergrad, bachelor's, right? Universities are generally composed of several colleges, a university sometimes has several colleges. In the United States, universities can be private and independent, like Yale University. Public and state governed, like Pennsylvania state system of higher education, or independent but state funded, like the University of Virginia. You can be independent, but funded by, the money comes from the state. Funded by means the money comes from, right? Or private. A number of career-specific courses are now available to students through the internet. So career-specific courses for career, like accountants. They can to study accounting, you can go online and go with the CGA and get a designation and pass the exams. You pay $1,000 for every exam, and you become an accountant. Vocational. Vocational education is a form of education focused on direct and practical training for a specific trade or craft. So it's for trades or crafts. What trade here does not mean export and import. Remember, trades, if you go to college to learn trades, you learn to be a carpenter, to be a locksmith, welding. These things are called trades. If you learn a trade, specific trade, these are also trades, or craft. That is the thing working with your hands. Vocational education may come in the form of an apprenticeship or internship, as well as special education. It could be an apprenticeship, internship, as well as special education. Special education is different. Or internship. Let's say goodbye here at the end of internship. Special education is for the people who are disabled, right? People with special needs. Special education, students with special needs. Let's remember, students, if you hear students with special needs, that's what it means. In the past, those who were disabled were often not eligible for public education. They couldn't go to school. Not eligible means not. If you're not eligible to do something, it means you're not qualified to do something. Not eligible means not qualified. Not qualified. If you're not eligible to vote in a country, you're not qualified to vote. Remember the word eligible? Maybe we had it a few years ago, but legible was different. Eligible means qualified. Children with disabilities were often educated by physicians or special tutors. So we're done. So just the last note here. So special education. In the past, those who were disabled were not eligible for public education. The word eligible is a very good word. Now we have eligible voters. If you want to vote in a country, you should be either 16 or 18. In Japan, who's an eligible voter? Who can vote? Now, children who were disabled were not eligible to go to school. They were not qualified to go to school. So eligible, for public education. Okay. Great.